Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Alcohol-Free Lifestyle podcast. This is Sarah Connolly, one of the coaches in the Alcohol-Free Lifestyle program. In this episode, we're going to be talking about ADHD. And ADHD is a condition that's becoming more and more prevalent. More and more people seem to be being diagnosed with ADHD, but there's also a lot about it that we don't know and understand. So I'm delighted today to welcome Faye. Faye is the founder of Untoxicated, which is Australia's largest alcohol-free social community. Currently got about 10,000 members, which is incredible. Now, Faye was or calls herself a heavy, high-functioning drinker that started in her teens. But in 2017, she ended up in inpatient detox when the wheels really fell off in her life. But she was determined not to let her sobriety ruin her life, and she created Untoxicated, which is still going strong. Faye's also been a TEDx speaker, a co-author, and featured widely across national media. She has a lifelong fascination in human behaviour, has a degree in psychology, certified grey area drinking coach, trained smart recovery facilitator, and she's currently undertaking a Master of Counselling. So Faye is highly qualified, but also particularly in ADHD, as she was diagnosed with it last year, I think. Faye, is that right?
Last year.
Yeah. And as a result, she's become really passionate about creating awareness between ADHD and addiction, because there's a really strong link there. So I'm really interested and excited to learn more about this and about your experiences. And for those people that are listening, if you feel that you relate to any of the symptoms or things that Faye talks about, we'll give you some ideas of where you can go at the end of this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
For now, welcome, Faye. Lovely to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me on, Sarah. Appreciate it. It's lovely to be here.
So if you could, for the listeners, start with explaining what exactly is ADHD and what are the common symptoms that people listening might recognise?
Yeah, okay. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition, and that basically means you're born with it. And it primarily affects the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that controls executive functioning. And what that means is the areas where we are methodical, where we put things into steps, where we organise things, it's kind of like the sensible part of the brain.
Yes.
And so that is underdeveloped in people with ADHD. So under an MRI or some kind of brain scan, they can see that actually it's different in neurotypical people to people with ADHD. And what that means in a nutshell is that we are deficient in a couple of neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are basically the chemical messengers that are sent to the brain to kind of, how we respond to threats, how we just in life, like they kind of prime us to take certain actions. And so dopamine is basically our reward, our motivation. And noradrenaline is the other one, and that is more around your fight or flight, your nervous system, your cognitive functioning. So basically, as my diagnosing psych explained it to me, is ADHD people have two modes: interesting or not interesting, and that's it. There's no in between. So if things are in the interesting category, right? We can zone in on that. We can hyper focus. We're like, yep, boom, we're in flow. If it's not interesting, life admin, things that require a lot of concentration and focus, forget it. It's like pulling teeth to get us to be able to do that task. So there are two, I guess, primary types of ADHD: inattentive and hyperactive. Or you can be the third, which is the lucky me. I've got both, combined type. So the hyperactive is things like you can't sit still, you're always fidgeting, you're getting up. Hyperactivity as well can be internal. So people think of little boys that are, misbehaving in the classroom and like out of control, but it can actually be the inner restlessness that you have within your body and your brain. So your mind is like ding, 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 ding. It's constant. And you can have just this feeling of sort of turbulence, I guess, inside as well. And that can be part of the hyperactivity. The inattentiveness is things like forgetfulness, really poor memory. I can be talking to someone and literally forget their name, even if I've known them for a long time. What is your name again? Time blindness is another one. So we struggle with time. So we will completely underestimate how long things are going to take and therefore end up taking a huge amount on quite often and then getting into a state of overwhelm and then burnout because we've taken too much on. Things like losing things, difficult to follow instructions, anything where we require to focus. So things like, if you're having to do strategic things at work or you're needing to write an assignment, anything that requires us to focus for long periods of time, particularly if we're not interested in it, is really taxing to kind of get our head in the game. But it can be like if you're particularly interested in something and you do go into hyperfocus, you kind of as well don't pick up on your body signals. So you might have sat there for 10 hours straight, focused on whatever that task is, and you're like, oh my God, I've forgotten to eat. Like it just didn't even occur to me. Oh my goodness, I haven't been to the toilet for, I've been bursting for like 3 hours, but I just haven't noticed my body signals because I've been so into this. Highly distractible. So, in an open plan office, it's really hard to stay on track. I can't remember if I mentioned this, but the blurting, the interrupting people. I mean, you and I have known each other for a while now. You've probably noticed that we can't, we're not doing it on purpose. Like when we've got a thing that's come into our mind, we kind of have to say it then and there. It's like, you've got to get it out, and that can really be interpreted as something that's very rude by neurotypical people. And it's not meant like that. It's literally, we can't wait to get the thing out. And, just things like life admin. I mean, I'll give an example, like food shopping for me was always an absolute nightmare when the kids were little, when I had kids at home, because there were too many steps involved. So to think about what you were going to have to eat, for the week ahead, to plan it, to then go to the shops, to have a list that covers everything, to bring it all back home without having forgotten anything, and then to actually follow through and make the meals was just so hard for my brain. And this was way before that I knew. And we can be quite sensitive to stimulation around us, and emotional regulation can also be part of the condition. So we are quite impulsive, and we can go from 0 to 100 in, quite a short space of time because we're very reactive to things emotionally. So, and particularly with women, because it's so linked to hormones exacerbating the condition. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine when we're in adolescence, puberty, and or menopause, it's almost like a ticking time bomb. You never know what you're going to get any day. And historically, women haven't been diagnosed. And I think that's why we're seeing a huge amount of women now getting a late diagnosis, because it was thought that women didn't have it, girls didn't have it. And it was also thought that people grew out of it. Yes. That it was a childhood affliction, and that was it. Once you're an adult, game over, you're all good now, off you go. And That just absolutely is not the case. Another thing worth mentioning just quickly is that it's highly heritable. It's got 80% heritability. And so that means if you're diagnosed or your child is diagnosed, there's a pretty high likelihood that someone else in your family has ADHD.
I've got a question about that, but I'm going to come to that after. I've got a few other questions. So the prefrontal cortex, I call it the Yoda brain, part of the brain is smaller. Is that what you said, or underdeveloped in somebody with ADHD? It's then the case, because everything that you're describing here, the lack of self-regulation, the reactivity, the overwhelm, overstimulation, is that because the more primitive part of the brain is more active because the prefrontal cortex is not able to intervene and regulate?
Yes. So that has the modulating effect, the prefrontal cortex, because it's underactive. Maybe underdeveloped is an incorrect term. It's underactive. So in most people, that's kind of modulating other parts of the brain. So everything plays nicely together. There's an adult in the room. And because it is underdeveloped, underactive, it doesn't fire up as much under examination, under scans. And so therefore, your kind of primitive brain is you're more likely to be running the show. Running the show.
Yeah, so essentially that time that ADHD people are spending in fight flight is probably a lot more than something that's not suffering from ADHD. And for those that are listening, that fight flight state is the state that we get into when we're reaching for alcohol, because we're looking to calm our nervous system. If your nervous system is fired up, like it sounds like it is with ADHD on a regular basis, we're going to talk about how that might affect someone's propensity to become addicted or reliant on substances to calm that overactive nervous system. The other question I had was about heritability, because as we now know that, there are things that are passed on where someone is susceptible to something, but only if the environment activates that susceptibility. Is that the case with ADHD, or is it just ADHD is like, you got it?
I think it's my understanding, as not a scientist, is that it's something you're born with. Yeah. There are many other conditions that can present similarly, and that's often why women are undiagnosed as well, because they are diagnosed with bipolar, they are diagnosed with borderline, they are diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and often that's not actually what it is, it's the ADHD. So it can also be things like PTSD can present similarly, or complex PTSD, personality disorders, so when you are assessed, go through the assessment process, they do need to, ascertain and establish whether those things are the predominant condition, or whether it's the ADHD. And they can co-present, because there's a huge amount of people that have a comorbid mental health condition when they've got ADHD. I think it is up to 80% have at least one additional mental health condition.
Yeah. So, which would make sense.
Yeah, but I mean, it kind of makes it pretty murky to be able to diagnose, because there's no kind of, straightforward way to get to that information. Really, it's a process it's an inexact science at the end of the day.
Yeah, so that's a really great kind of picture of what it's like to live with ADHD that Faye has just described, and it sounds fraught and frantic and quite stressful. You yourself, as we said in the intro, had experienced challenges with alcohol to the point where you ended up in a detox. Yeah. And at this point, not knowing that you had ADHD, would you be comfortable to share a little bit about your story And then how that discovery put kind of a new lens on your experience with alcohol.
Yep, absolutely. So I think, the part that alcohol played for me. So firstly, I grew up in an environment where there was alcoholism on both sides of my family, going back, certainly on one side a few generations. And so there is an environmental component, I believe, with addiction in terms of what you see modeled in the home. But, also the culture, the UK, Australia, the US, we are alcohol-laden cultures. And so there are those social and cultural norms as well. But for me, I think drinking was, I remember the first time I got really drunk. I was 13 and it switched my brain off. I was like, thank God, thank God, because it has a calming effect on the frantic ding, 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 ding pinball head that you have quite often with ADHD, that internal hyperactivity that I mentioned earlier. And that was it, really, for me. I was like, this is great. This takes me out of this constant state of overthinking, anxiety, trying to manage, a bazillion things that are going through my head at once. They say that it's like having, 100 tabs open on your laptop. And that's exactly what it's like. It's like, which piece of information am I kind of processing at the moment? It's hard to. So with the alcohol, 100%. And, we are attracted quite often to chaos. We are attracted to stressful situations. And, I found myself I was a single parent in Australia. I didn't have any family support because I'd moved over with my now ex-husband, who's Australian, and just the levels of stress were off the charts. I had a history as well of, prior to that, in my teens, partying, as most people do, drugs and alcohol. But it just progressed for me. And I think combined with the stress and the sheer load of everything I was carrying, it was kind of like the writing was on the wall for this to develop into something more serious. And I think there were, like all of us, there are protective factors that mean during that course of when we have been drinking heavily, there are certain things that kind of keep us in check to some degree. So whether that's, you've got a partner who doesn't really drink, who is kind of keeping an eye, or you're going out to a workplace. And so you have to make sure that you're not as ridiculously hungover as you would be if you were working from home, maybe. You've got kids at home, so you have to get up and do stuff. Once some of those protective factors were taken out of the mix for me, that's when things descended into really in a needing to get some intervention, essentially. It spiraled out of control. It had been on that trajectory for quite some time. I've been drinking heavily for 20, 30 years, but because I'd always been high functioning, we could dismiss it. We're like, I'm doing a degree, I'm working full time, I've got a reasonably good career, I'm raising kids, I'm doing all the things, I exercise, I do this, I do that. It keeps you in this loop of denial, because we have this narrative, as you're well aware, Sarah, of I'm either an alcoholic, which isn't a medically correct term, or I'm quote unquote fine. And there's no in between. So I'm not like those other people, because those are the people that end up in rehab and detox. And then the progression of alcohol use disorder, if we don't take some steps to change it. And by the way, I'd been going to alcohol counselling. I started in 2001 and I didn't stop till 2017. So I'd gone in and out of various attempts to stop using naltrexone, Camphor, all of these sorts of things, but then going back to, no, I'm fine. Until there was no denying that I wasn't fine. And I think when I got the diagnosis, I was pretty peed off. I've got to be honest, I was quite angry because I just thought I was 48 when I got the diagnosis. And once I started learning about the link with addiction, it just angered me because I was like, this potentially might not have, but potentially could have avoided things going as far as they did. And there's also a grieving process, which is about what could have been had I found this earlier and been medicated.
Yeah, 100%.
What could I have achieved, because it's the fact that you've got the IQ, the drive, the this, the that, but your brain is sabotaging you.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like I hadn't had a number of interactions with the mental health system over that period of time. And yet, it was never mentioned. It was never suggested. It was because, again, they didn't think women.
Did finding out when you got the diagnosis, did that do anything for you in the context of reducing any shame that you may have felt about your history with alcohol?
That's a great question. And yes, it did. Yes, it did. Because I was like, well, of course. There's such a strong link here. And I had so many things loaded up, I guess, that did predispose me. The genetic component, the environmental, cultural, social, and then add this into the mix as well. And it was kind of almost like a ticking time bomb. It was going to happen. And it did actually make me feel as well more forgiving of family members who I had experienced as a child, their alcohol use and other issues, substance issues. I was like, they couldn't help it either. So that did help to some degree, because when I look retrospectively, I could see actually that almost my whole family were neurodiverse.
Yeah. And just to clarify that for listeners that might not know that term, that just means different to the perfect brain, right?
It basically means ADHD, autism, OCD, what used to be called oppositional defiant disorder, which is now called pathological demand avoidance. Dyslexia, I believe, is also in the mix with that as well. So it's all of these things where the brain just works differently to a neurotypical person.
Yeah.
James Swanwick here. Just a quick interruption to share some of the results that folks have been getting inside of our 90-day stop drinking process as it relates to profession, career, and wealth creation. This is Jeff Salzburn from Minnesota who says, I did an additional deal this month. This is Gaetano from Massachusetts. I've increased revenue. Susie Vaughan says, I've generated 20% more leads. Joe Worley from Michigan says, I got a promotion. Tim Steele from Pennsylvania says, I've generated more clients and income. And Russell from Australia says, I've saved thousands. So if progressing in your career, profession, business, growing your wealth is a motivation for you to stop drinking, then I invite you to go to alcoholfreelifestyle.com/Project 90. Check out the details about Project 90 and how we may be able to support you to stop drinking for at least 90 days through our process and really drive your professional life. Okay, back to the show.
And isn't it, I think we're becoming more and more conscious now that the way that we look at the brain and from a judgment perspective has to be exactly the same as we look at other organs of the body. But historically, the minute something goes wrong with the brain, it becomes a moral issue or it becomes that person's responsibility. Whereas if someone has a bad heart, we're like, go take some heart medication. But someone's got a brain that's not working right, all of a sudden it's something about them that's wrong. Their personality, who they are in a way.
Yeah, it's a defectiveness. It's a personal or moral failing of some kind or weakness, and addiction's the same. So I think, And I think even as individuals, that can be hard for us as well, because, when we are experiencing mental health challenges or neurodiversity, it's another thing to beat ourselves with, to kind of go, why can't I be like everybody else?
Yeah.
Why can't I get my shit together? Why does everyone else find this stuff easy and I don't? How come everyone else is functioning in this way and I just can't seem to? I can't even get out the front door. It takes me 2 hours because I'm walking from room to room going, oh, God, where did I put my keys again? And then, but I need to remember this and blah, 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 And so there's a lot of self-flagellation that goes on, I think, with neurodiversity and any mental health issue.
And addiction, right? Like addiction being perpetuated by that cycle of shame and blame because there's something morally wrong with us. I mean, that's a wonderful topic that I'd love to talk about one day, in terms of how we're starting to see addiction in a different way, in a more positive, supportive way. But there's a way to go there. But back to ADHD.
Yes.
So it did two things in a way, that diagnosis. It allowed you to look at your past with perhaps some disappointment or regret or anger, frustration, that you'd gone through all of that without that knowledge of the diagnosis. But at the same time, it kind of clarified things for you. It's like, okay, yeah, right. Wow. That's what was going on. It wasn't me. It wasn't necessarily my family. It was something that was as a result of this condition.
Correct. And I think someone, it's a bit like in the first year of living alcohol-free, sobriety, whichever term you like to use, they say don't make any big changes because you're going to be all over the place. And it's the same post-diagnosis for a lot of people. And people did warn me in some of the groups that I'm in and things like that. They're like, yep, just buckle up. Buckle up, baby, because this is going to be a roller coaster. Because there's some days you're feeling pretty positive about it and you're like, yeah, this is all the good things about it, and then other days you do feel quite sad about how things could have been had this not been in the mix, and also how much you've struggled in the past. You're feeling a sense of loss for past yous. That makes sense. It's like, all this time I've had this inner struggle going on, and I kind of just thought this is what everyone had, and now I can see it for what it is, and now I'm validating it. It's probably a bit bigger than I ever thought in terms of how much of a part it is playing in my life. And so it's just coming to terms with all of these pieces. My first thought when the psychologist told me was, A, I burst into tears, which is quite unlike me, and B, I thought I could have done a PhD by now.
So are ADHD sufferers high achievers generally?
They can be. So we can, I wonder if women are more inclined towards this, but because we've had to really function highly to achieve. So we're on, like you said earlier about the fight or flight. We're hypervigilant, so we are constantly on the lookout for threat, and part of that threat is failure. My boss is going to be angry with me if I haven't, or I'm going to get a bad grade, or I'm going to, the kids will be annoyed if I haven't organised a party that, or I'll feel bad about that if I haven't organised a wonderful birthday party for my, or am I a bad friend because I haven't spent enough time. So we're constantly, I guess, looking at those things, and often we use the self-flagellation to propel ourselves to achieve.
Yeah. And is there an element of perfectionism that goes in with that?
Yeah, big time.
Yeah.
Big time. Yeah, because it's your self-identity. So you want to still feel I mean, I can only speak for me as someone who's only fairly recently found out that this is in the mix. So I'm not sure if it's different for somebody who does know earlier and then comes to terms with it earlier. But for me, a big part of achieving has been that perfectionism, 100%.
Yeah, because of the fear of failure. Yeah, yeah. My question that I've got at this point in time is that how broad do you think this condition is? Because a lot of what you're describing, I think a lot of people would listen to and say, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. And so I'm wondering if you feel that there's a lot of people that are suffering from this condition that don't know, and suffering at varying degrees of intensity.
Yes.
Would you say that was fair to say?
I think there's a couple of components there to that question. And one is that we know that with our use of technology, that is shifting the way our brains work. So I think what we're seeing is what one of the experts in the field, I think he calls it VAST. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it means basically in the general population, we're seeing some of these components, I suppose, of ADHD, like the inability to focus, the distractibility, all of these things as a result of technology. Yeah. With the ADHD, it really is if you're on the lower end of the scale of ADHD, it might not even be worth you getting a diagnosis because you're like, yeah, I'm trucking along fine. It's manageable. But if you are up the pointier end, I think it's really about the impairment. And I hate to use that because I'm someone who prefers a strengths-based approach, but it's the impairment and how much it is impacting your life in a negative way or detrimental way. So that's not to say there aren't workarounds, there aren't loads of things you can do, but it's at this point in time, how much is it impacting your life and preventing you from doing the things that you would like to do and or achieving the things you want to achieve. And or your mental health as well. Yeah. So that's where I think kind of if people are listening and they identify with some of the things that I'm talking about, it really is like, to what degree is this causing a problem in your life?
Yes, which is the intelligent question really with everything, isn't it? Like
it's the same with the alcohol, isn't it?
With alcohol, it's, if it's causing more harm than good. Or affecting your life in a negative way on a regular basis, then it's worth doing something to intervene. On that note, what, in terms of the ADHD, you've kind of talked about the being in the fight, flight and overstimulate and all those things. Are they the main reasons why somebody with ADHD might turn to alcohol and end up being addicted, or is there a host of reasons why someone with ADHD might be more prone to becoming addicted to a substance?
Yeah, there's quite a few. So part of that is that baseline lack of dopamine.
Yeah.
And that means that we are more risk takers, we're impulsive, and that lack of dopamine is leading us to try and get more dopamine so we can be on a par with the general population, basically. And so people with ADHD are much more prone to addiction, and that doesn't just mean substance use disorder of any kind. That can be food, gambling, gaming, sex. We are much more, how can we get, without realizing, obviously, how can we get that dopamine that we are lacking? But I also think, it is what I said before around the feeling like a failure. This cycle of it is so exhausting, of this overwhelm and burnout, taking too much on. And so we're self-medicating trying to switch the brain off. Lots of people have issues with sleep. Low self-esteem is, the research shows, goes hand in hand with the ADHD because of all these things that I've mentioned. Social anxiety is another big one for people. We're bored. We like instant gratification because we don't have the adult part going, hold on. So we can be short-term thinkers. We're in the here and the now. And so it's just, how can I feel better now? And, switch this thing off. So, and we're emotionally reactive. So we're dysregulated a lot. And that means, if you haven't learned healthy coping mechanisms as well, we're not interested in the longer term solution of like, how do I down-regulate? How do I, go and take the yoga class? We're like, we want it now. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And so I think it's a combination of all of those things that feed into our need for or our drive towards substances.
Yeah. And I guess that sort of lower dopamine levels, when you do take a substance, whatever it might be, you actually feel more relief than somebody that doesn't have low dopamine and isn't from a stressed state, because you are actually relieving that stress with the alcohol. So it almost is like has a better effect, a nicer effect than somebody that hasn't come from that place of fight flight where they're just having a drink and they're fine.
Yes.
They'll have the drink and they'll be like, the relief will be so great that it's like, oh, like you said, when you were 13, you felt this, oh my God, the magic elixir has arrived.
Big time. And also another thing the research shows is that we're way less likely to complete programs, rehabs, any kind of treatment, again, because of, the inability to think longer term, the impulsivity, the emotional regulation piece, all of these things. That's like, nah, I'm out.
Yeah.
I'm too hard.
So given that we, as far as we know at this point in time, ADHD is a heritable condition. Can we call it a condition?
Neurodevelopmental disorder.
Mm-hmm. And it's something that doesn't disappear when you get older, so it stays with you. How can somebody with this condition, how is it treatable, I guess is my question.
Partially is the answer to that. So there's a raft of medication that you can use. So you need to go and see a psychiatrist for that. My thoughts are that the earlier you get it, the better, because I think that neuroplasticity when you're younger is much, much enhanced. And so therefore much more malleable, the brain. And then once you're older, like in your 40s, all those associations and behaviours that the brain understands and the way that we've learned to function, your neural pathways, as they're pretty firmly laid down.
Yes.
And so the medication has been, for me personally, quite patchy. But they also recommend, I'm not sure the audience, I'm guessing is primarily in the States. Here in Australia, they recommend coaching, ADHD coaching in conjunction with medication, and or CBT is another one. And that has been issued in the clinical guidelines that were released last year. And that's because the medication you don't just take the medication and boom, that's it, you're fixed. That's unfortunately, this has been very disappointing to me because I'm going to take
now. Give it me now.
I'm just going to be a normal person now. They reckon that it's up to 50% is the medication. That's like your optimal. And the stimulants have an opposite effect on an ADHD brain in that they calm.
Got it.
So people think, well, why would you take what effectively is speed or meth? From a chemical compound perspective, they're pretty much identical. On a fast-moving brain. Like, surely that doesn't, that's sort of paradoxical. That doesn't make sense, but it calms and provides those neurotransmitters that you're missing.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So if anybody is listening to this podcast and they think that they might be suffering from ADHD, what advice could you give them that, or guidance, should I say?
I would recommend to start having a dig around online. If you think that this is something that might be in the mix for you, we are seeing it's estimated about 5% of the population have ADHD, 5% of the adult population. I personally believe, having seen so many people, this is obviously completely anecdotal, in the alcohol-free space, I would say about 80% of my friends in the alcohol-free space have been diagnosed. And I constantly, every time I do a podcast or speak about this stuff, have people inboxing me and saying, hey, what would you recommend? And then they come back to me a month or two later and they've got a diagnosis. Yeah. So it's huge, because we are so much more, 2 to 3 times more likely than the neurotypical person to have a substance use disorder, and alcohol is the highest out of all of those. So what I would recommend to people is go to trusted sources of information. TikTok isn't that.
Really? I get all my news from TikTok.
It's great. It's creating awareness, right? But, I think with a lot of anything that's in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose, most of us could tick a number of, we could look at any mental health condition and go, oh, yeah, that looks, I've got that, and I've got a bit of that, and I've got a bit of that. So use resources that are more likely to be evidence-based. So, for example, there's 2 psychiatrists who are the preeminent sources, I suppose. One is Russell Barkley and another one is Ned Hallowell. Ned Hallowell himself does have ADHD. Mm-hmm. So anything that they do is generally worth having a look at. And there's lots of stuff on YouTube. Or go to online magazines like Attitude, that's ADD, Attitude. So instead of Attitude, or CHAD, which is CHADD. Really look up, do a bit of homework. You can do online tests like Connors, you might be able to find online. Just start getting a bit of an idea. I would, maybe join some Facebook groups and just start getting a feel for it. And if you think it might still be in the mix for you, go and see your GP, your doctor, but go with a list. Excuse me, because we forget.
Yeah,
so
right.
When we're in front of the practitioner, we have forgotten what the things are that are affecting our lives.
Yeah.
So start making a list of all the things that you're noticing and go to your GP and tell them. But I would also really do your homework about the type of practitioner that you want to be referred to, and start looking for someone who's good, who's got a good reputation. And I say that because I went to see a psychiatrist back in 2014 and he dismissed me after about 20 minutes and told me to go and read a book on meditation. Excuse me, after taking my history. And that's 8 years where I could have been treated for this. 8 years where I experienced, needing to go to detox that might potentially or might not have been alleviated. So make sure you go to someone who knows what they're doing. And then go and ask your GP for a referral to that person.
Yeah.
And this is where you've got to do a little bit of your own homework. Only qualified psychologists and psychiatrists can assess and diagnose you. So don't just go to any old psychologist, any old psychiatrist. Really do a little bit of your own homework. Excuse me. And that's I think personally the best course.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Faye. That has been so interesting to me and so much information that I'm sure there are going to be people listening that have learned a lot today. So I really thank you for joining us on this podcast.
My pleasure. Can I just leave just quickly on a positive note, though?
Yes, please.
Because a lot of what I've said sounds quite negative. And I am in that initial 12 months of discovery of, understanding this. But there are quite a lot of positives as well. So it has been said that our brains are the equivalent of the original hunter-gatherer brains. This is a theory that's been put forward. So even though we are hypervigilant, we are people that have been out there on alert, hunting for food. We are quick, flexible problem solvers, creative. We're able to adapt, challenge really quickly. We thrive in chaos. We're big picture thinkers. We are, very finely attuned to people. So we are, generally quite empathetic and compassionate towards others. And we can get so much done when we're into it. So the key is finding the things you are into and stop trying to, and I'm working on this myself, trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. Give yourself permission to play to your strengths, because there are lots there when you take a step back from looking at the things where your life isn't going right to looking at, wow, look at all these things that I can do that other people find more challenging.
Yeah, I love that. And Faye's testament to the fact that you can do it all and have this ADHD. She's just done so much in her very short time, and she's going to be doing a lot more of wonderful things, I know. So I really appreciate you joining us, Faye, and I will put those resources in the link below the podcast. I'll put some links there for anybody that wants to check out more, learn more about ADHD. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. And a huge thank you to Faye Lawrence, who has joined us today, for all of her insights on this topic. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast, and look forward to seeing you soon.
James Swanwick here again. Thank you so much for listening to the show. I want to send you some free stuff. If you haven't yet got the Alcohol Freedom Formula, then you can get that at alcoholfreelifestyle.com/guide. The YouTube channel is alcoholfreelifestyle.com/YouTube. I put out lots of educational videos on my Instagram page at James Swanwick. You can also find me on TikTok at James Swanwick. If this show has benefited you, I would so appreciate you leaving a review and giving it 5 stars. We have a 5-day no alcohol challenge, a 30-day no alcohol challenge. You can get details over at alcoholfreelifestyle.com. And if you would like to apply to be part of Project 90, which is our flagship process where you get a community, 7 coaching calls per week are available to you, a like-minded community, mostly folks in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, then you are welcome to apply. You can get all the details over at alcoholfreelifestyle.com/Project 90, and the details are in the show notes. Thank you again for listening. I will catch you on the next one.